quick review of last week. We looked at Daniel chapter 1 last week. And just kind of a big picture perspective here. Daniel takes place in the midst of what is known as the Israelite exile. And so the deal was this, okay? God called the nation of Israel to be His light to the world. In the midst of a world full of darkness and brokenness and sin, God wanted Israel to be kind of a beacon of righteousness. A people who loved Him and followed Him and obeyed what He commanded. How well did Israel do at that? Really well or not so well? Not so well. And so basically what happened was that God began to send prophets, and the prophets had really a simple but a clear message, and the message was, turn this ship around or the wrath of God is fixing to rain down on you. And so God sent prophet after prophet after prophet for year after year after year and decade after decade after decade, even century after century after century. Did the Israelites turn this thing around? Did the Israelites really repent? Yes or no? No. And so finally, the wrath of God rained down on Israel. And the way that it rained down on Israel was through these exiles. All right? In the year 722 BC, the northern half of Israel fell to the Assyrians. And then in the year 586 BC, the southern half of Israel fell to the Babylonians. And Daniel is a book that takes place right here. Daniel is a book that takes place when the Israelites are stuck in Babylon. Now, the deal is this. When the Babylonians came in, and when they conquered Israel, before they conquered Israel, they came in and they messed around with Jerusalem. And when they messed around with Jerusalem, the Babylonians took the best and the brightest of the Israelites to live in the kingdom of Babylon. Now, among the best and the brightest of the Israelites at this time were four men. One is Daniel. He's the one after whom this book is named. Another was named Shadrach. Another was named Meshach. And another was named what? Yeah, Abednego. All right? And so we're going to get to these guys in Daniel chapter 3. Right now, we are still in Daniel chapter 2, which is what we're going to be covering this week. And Daniel, when he is in the midst of Babylon, he's in the midst of a foreign land with foreign gods, false gods. And so one of the big questions of the book of Daniel is this. How do I stand up for truth in the midst of a culture that is full of lies? Now, the good news is we don't have that question or consideration at all in our day and age. We don't have that problem standing up for truth in the midst of a culture that is full of lies, right? So Daniel has nothing to teach us of relevance today, right? See, this is one of the beauties of biblical books. It's a funny thing how history repeats itself over and over and over again. Daniel is trying to stand up for truth in the midst of a culture that is full of lies. You know what we are called to do? We are called to, what do you know? Stand up for truth in the midst of a culture that is full of lies. So, everybody kind of understand the setting? And so, if you got your Bibles, turn to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2. There are some notes still there on that back section of the table. You can pick those up, and we can dig in and dive in together. Daniel chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king of Babylon at this time, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his mind was troubled so that he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and they stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Now, a couple of things here that I want to tease out. The first thing has to do with the first line of the first verse of chapter 2. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had some dreams. Now, I want you to turn back to Daniel chapter 1. Okay? Daniel chapter 1, when Daniel first goes to Babylon, okay? Can somebody read Daniel chapter 1, verse 5? Daniel chapter 1, verse 5. There are no hard words in it, I promise. Don't be shy. No weird names, no nothing. Daniel chapter 1, verse 5.
Food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they went under the king's service.
Okay, here's what I want you to pick up on. How long was Daniel supposed to be trained before he enters the king's service? 3 years. 3 years. Nebuchadnezzar comes to the throne, he exiles some of these Israelites, and they are to be trained for 3 years, then they go into the king's service. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, you know where Daniel is? Daniel is in the king's service. But if you notice, okay, the chapter opens in the 2nd year of his reign. Now, 2 minus 3 is -1. In other words, do you notice the math doesn't add up here? Daniel's in the king's service in the 2nd year of his reign, but before he could go into the king's service, he had to be trained for how many years? 3 years. Now, here's the reason that I make a big deal out of this, okay? There are some people who will do just about anything to undermine the authority, the authenticity, and the veracity of the Bible. And they will look at stuff like this, and they will say, see? This is all a bunch of bunk. People can't even add in biblical times. To which I would say, yes, they can. Okay, here's the way that this works, okay? When a king came to a throne, they had what they would call an accession year, all right? And that was the year that the king became king. Now, the accession year was not counted in the rules and in the reigns of a king. And so if we were to use our calendar, not the same as the Babylonian calendar, okay? But if we were to use our calendar and somebody was to become king, let's say on January 2nd, that first year from January 2nd all the way to December 31st would be year 0. You wouldn't count it. It wouldn't be until January 1st of the next year that you would start with year 1. And so, this is probably what's going on here with Daniel. Daniel is being trained 3 years. The first year of King Nebuchadnezzar in the annals of Babylonian history is not counted. And so all of a sudden the math begins to add up a whole lot easier. And this just goes to the fact that if you just think about this, and if you just look at this kind of stuff, you find over and over and over again that the biblical authors aren't stupid. They know how to add, they know how to subtract, and they're giving us the straight skinny about what actually happened. And so, in the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. Now, notice how the king responds. He summoned magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. How do you think the Israelites are going to feel about folks like magicians and enchanters and sorcerers and astrologers? Do you think that good little Jewish boys are going to be all about those guys, or are they going to be told that those guys were like bad? Which one? Bad. All right, turn to Deuteronomy 18. Deuteronomy 18. Verses 10 through 12. Anybody want to take a crack at this? Deuteronomy 18. Verses 10 through 12.
There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering. Anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium or a necromancer or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you.
Key line here, for whoever does those things is an abomination before the Lord. NIV says that these practices are detestable. Now, in Babylon, not only do these guys exist, these spiritists, these fortune tellers, these mediums, these guys are real close and cozy to the king. Not only do these guys exist, these guys have power. And so now Daniel has to figure out, how do I stand up for truth in the midst of a bunch of power that is corrupt? Our world doesn't have that problem at all, right? And so, this is what Daniel has to deal with. The king, he has a dream. It troubles him, and so he turns to these corrupt people, these fortune tellers, to try to figure out what it means. Verse 4. The astrologers, to whom the king turns, answered the king in Aramaic, because that was the language of the Babylonian Empire. They answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Now, here's what I want you to notice, okay? The very first thing that the astrologers and the necromancers, the fortune tellers do, okay, when the king turns to them because he's had a dream that troubles him, is they flatter him a little bit. They say, "O king, live forever." Now, why would the astrologers do this? The king has had a dream that has troubled him, which means that he has the sense that maybe something bad is brewing on the horizon. And so the very first thing that these guys do is they try to soothe his troubled soul by saying, "Oh, don't worry, king. You're going to live forever. You got it going on. The kingdom is safe in your hands. In fact, we really want you to live and to reign and to rule forever. You are so awesome, king." These guys are kind of the ultimate yes men of the empire. These guys are paid to tell the king what the king wants to hear. But this time, in Daniel chapter 2, that ain't going to work. Verse 5. The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you," this is delightful, "cut into pieces." Doesn't that sound lovely? "And your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Now, these astrologers, these necromancers, these fortune tellers, they have two different options. Number one, they're going to be able to tell the king what he dreamed. Now, notice, these astrologers are not called to tell the king about what he has dreamed. These astrologers are called to tell the king what he has dreamed. In other words, the king has it in his mind, in his head, what he has dreamed, and now he's calling on the astrologers, and he's saying to them, "You guys tell me what I have in my head." Now, if they can do that, they receive glory, honor, power, fame, prestige, privilege, the whole shooting match. If they don't, option number 2, I cut you into pieces. In other words, things are either going to go really well for these guys or really bad for these guys. Now, just so you know, King Nebuchadnezzar, he was not averse to making these kind of threats. Go to the very next chapter. This is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And look at verse 29 of chapter 3. This is after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are rescued from the fiery furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar is very impressed by their God. And look at what Nebuchadnezzar says, Daniel 3, verse 29. Who wants to read that?
"Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way."
This was standard fare punishment of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? If you go against the king, two things happen. You get cut into pieces, your houses get destroyed. That was standard fare punishment. Not prison, not a parking ticket, not any of that. This is the way that Nebuchadnezzar ruled and reigned. He was kind of an autocratic despot, really. This guy knew that he had the power, and he was not afraid to use it. Now, notice what the astrologers do in verse 7. When the king says, okay, things are either going to go really well for you or really bad for you, they say in verse 7, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Now, notice what the astrologers say in verse 4. They say, "Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." And so here's kind of what's going on. Have you guys ever watched, let's say, a political debate, or maybe somebody who's speaking for a political candidate or for an elected official, and they're being peppered with all of these questions, and no matter what the questions are, they go right back to their talking points? Doesn't matter what the question is, they just say whatever it is they want to say? Okay, that's really what's happening with these astrologers, because the astrologers know that they're in trouble. And so they start off with their talking point, "O king, live forever. We're going to flatter you a little bit. Now just tell your servants what the dream is, and then we'll tell you about what the dream means. King Nebuchadnezzar says, I don't want to do that. I want you to tell me what my dream is, and then you can tell me about what my dream means. But I don't want to tell you what my dream is so you can tell me about it. You got to tell me what's in my head. Astrologers know they can't do this. You know why? Because they're slimy charlatans. And so they go right back to their talking points. Oh, king, tell us what the dream is, and we will tell you about what it means. No matter what the king says, the astrologers keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. And so, verse 8. I am certain that you are trying to gain time, the king answered. By the way, if you got a Bible underlined gain time, we'll come back to that, okay? I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. It's that whole cut you into pieces and, ruin your house thing. Okay? You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. And so the king is not going to fall for the talking points, and he's not going to fall for the flattery. The king, obviously, is especially concerned about this dream. And he knows that something bad could be fixing to happen to him, and so he wants to know the straight skinny. He doesn't want the rosy picture from his yes men. Verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, there's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. Now, I want you to notice what the astrologers finally come back to the king with. They finally come back to the king with a bunch of limitations and stipulations, okay? They begin with astrology's limitations, and they say, you know what? There's no man on earth who can do what you ask. By the way, does anybody know if that is a true or false statement? Anybody read to the end of this chapter? Is there a man on earth who can do what the king asks, yes or no? I'll give you one guess at his name. Daniel. Yeah, we'll come back to that, okay? But the astrologers admit that astrology has some limitations. And one of the limitations of astrology is reading somebody else's mind. They figure astrology can do a lot, but that's one thing that it can't do. Okay, second limitation are limitations that the astrologers then try to place on the king. They say, no king, no matter how great or mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or astrologer. Let me translate that for you. King Nebi, you're getting too big for your britches. You're getting a little bit too haughty. Your head is getting a little bit too big. I don't care how great and mighty and powerful you are, this kind of request is utterly dumb and ridiculous. Astrology has limitations, they say to the king. You have limitations, they say to the king. And then most importantly, the gods have limitations, they say to the king. The only entities that can sort this out for you, the only entities who could possibly do something like this are the gods. And then notice this last line, okay? Because this sets up the theology of the whole chapter. And they do not live among men. That's another way of saying the gods are silent. They're silent. Now, the Babylonians had a whole pantheon of gods. And yet the gods didn't seem to be much help to them now, did they? You know, it's interesting in our day, this is a great majority of people's theology of not the gods, but God. God does not live among men. God does not have answers for people. God does not reveal His will or His ways to you and to me. Let me give you 3 theologies that we see this in, okay? We see this in agnosticism. Anybody know what agnosticism is? Agnosticism is when you say, there could be a God, there could not be a God. God hasn't given me enough information to decide one way or the other, and so I don't really care. I'm just going to live as if, well, probably there really is no God, and He's not going to bug me. Okay? Another way that we do this is deism. Deism is when you believe that there is a God, but He is distant and detached from everyday affairs because, quite frankly, He has better things to do, like worrying about Himself. Okay? Kind of the analogy that is often used to describe deism is that of a watchmaker. And the idea is this: when God made the heavens and the earth, He wound it up like a watch, and then He let it run. And now that God is letting it run, He's moved on to other things. He's not worried about you or about me. Now, the way this came out in Babylon specifically, okay, was not in a form so much of agnosticism, okay? They cared whether or not there were gods. Not so much in the form of deism, because they would talk to the gods a lot and they would have a lot of worship services for the gods. But the way that it came out in Babylon was in a form of nationalism. Now, here's what nationalism says, okay? Nationalism says the gods would sanction what the Babylonians did because of who the Babylonians were. In other words, the gods were a convenient excuse to allow the Babylonians to do whatever it is that they wanted to do. And so, if they wanted to hold a religious celebration that was really all about Nebuchadnezzar's power more than the gods' power, they would do that. Nationalism was kind of a thin veneer of religiosity layered over the real deal in Babylon, which was nothing but politics and power. For them, the gods were not an ever-present help in trouble. For them, the gods were not things that you really worried about worshiping. For them, the gods were a means to an end. They would appeal to the gods, they would talk about the gods, but they didn't really trust in the gods when push came to shove. The gods were a thin veneer of religiosity over politics and power. Now, what kind of nation would ever try to pull this kind of thing off? Putting a god as a thin veneer over politics and power. Assuming that a god would sanction anything you wanted to do, even if that was manifestly evil or wrong. You guys ever heard of something called manifest destiny from the 19th century? Isn't it funny how it sounds a whole lot like this? This is what the Babylonians were doing. And so it's so interesting. The astrologers will appeal to the gods and talk about the gods, but then when the gods actually need to show up and do something, like save their lives, or like tell them what Nebuchadnezzar actually dreamed, they know in their heart of hearts that the gods are worthless. The gods are good for this, but they're not actually good for saving you. That's the theology. I want to pause right there. Any questions or comments? Because I explained it all so well. Verse 12. This made the king so angry when the astrologers put all of these restrictions and constrictions on what they can do, on what the king can do, on what the gods can do. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. Notice, not just the astrologers, not just the necromancers, not just the fortune tellers, but all the wise men of Babylon. Now, there's a problem with this, okay? Who is among the wise men of Babylon? Daniel. Now, this really has to sink for Daniel, right? Because he's just gone through 3 years of training so that he can be a wise man of Babylon, okay? This is like his second week on the job, and all of a sudden, his execution order has come down. That can't be really particularly dreamy for Daniel, but nevertheless, that's what happened. So, the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to put them to death as well. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. Go back to chapter 1. Look at verse 20. Chapter 1, verse 20. Somebody want to read that?
As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all physicians and conquerors who were in all his realm.
Thank you very much. All right, and so, in chapter 1, verse 20, we learn that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're wiser than everybody else. They're more insightful than everybody else. And so now Daniel's going to use some of this wisdom and this insight that he has. By the way, why would Daniel be wiser than all the astrologers, enchanters, necromancers, and everybody else in the kingdom? Why? Because Daniel has a wisdom that they don't have. Daniel has a wisdom that they could never hope to conjure up. Because Daniel may just worship a God who would dare to live among men and reveal himself to them. Just maybe. I don't know. We'll see. In fact, that could be the whole point of Nebi's dream. We'll see. And so Daniel has this amazing wisdom. He's able to speak to the king with wisdom and tact, to the king's chief official. And he asked the king's officer. Now, notice the way he does this. This is brilliant. He says, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Notice, he doesn't protest the decree itself. He doesn't go to Arioch and say, I cannot believe this. I just got out of this king's stupid school, or I've had to work for 3 years to get my degree, and now I'm going to get my head chopped off, and I'm going to be cut into pieces. This is dumb. This king has gone crazy. No. Instead he goes, now why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Is he having a bad day? Is something wrong? Anything I can help him with? Notice how Daniel plays this. He doesn't protest it. It's more like, well, what can I do for you? Very subtle, very kind, very sensitive. Arioch explains the matter to Daniel, verse 16. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Now, go back to verse 8, okay? When we got the astrologers and the necromancers and the fortune tellers, all right? And they keep on telling the king, hey, king, tell us what the dream is and we'll tell you what it's about, okay? The king answers, verse 8, I am certain that you are trying to, what did I ask you to underline earlier? Gain time. Now, notice what Daniel does in verse 16. He goes into the king and he asks for. This takes guts now, doesn't it? Back with the necromancers, the astrologers, the fortune tellers, the king says, I'm certain that you're trying to gain time, so I'm going to issue an execution edict for all of you. So Daniel goes in and he makes the same request that the king flatly rejected of all of these other guys. And yet, so interesting, amazingly enough, then Daniel went to his house, verse 17, and he explained the matters to his friends. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so the king grants his request. Not only is Daniel wise in the way that he talks to the king's chief official going, is everything okay? Is there anything I can help with? Daniel has a lot of guts too. He's willing to go to the king and ask for something that the king has already flatly rejected. And he gets it. Wonder why he gets it when everybody else doesn't. You know, one of the interesting features, talked about this last weekend, the book of Daniel is in a genre of literature known as apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic is a word that simply means an unveiling or a revelation. And so the whole idea of apocalyptic literature is that there are things that were heretofore unknown that are being unveiled or revealed. Okay? That's why the last book of the Bible is apocalyptic literature, and we call it Revelation. Okay, and a lot of times these things are unveiled or revealed in visions or dreams, kind of like what's going on here in Daniel 2, where the king has a dream, okay? But the deal is this. In apocalyptic literature, we see God working two different ways. One way is through this amazing, fantastic unveiling and revelation. The other way is in a way that is behind the scenes. When you follow the stories of apocalyptic literature, a lot of them just seem to fall into place perfectly. What could happen to somebody doesn't happen to somebody. The worst case scenario falls through, so the best case scenario can happen. The astrologers get the boot from the king. Daniel gets a little bit of time from the king. And so the question of apocalyptic literature is not just what is being revealed, but who's making this whole story work out. God works in express ways, but He also works in hidden ways. He's the God of history. He's the one who makes all of these stories go. This is why, for example, in the book of Esther, how many times is God mentioned? None. Where is God working? All over the place. This is what's going on in Daniel too. Even when his name isn't explicitly stated, he's still there and he's still working, and all of this is going to work out. And so, Daniel, verse 17. Returned to his house, and he explained the matters to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, two things. Daniel goes and he talks over what's going on in the conversation that he had with the king with his friends. I talked about this last Sunday in ABC. When it comes to help that we need, we really do need two different kinds of help, okay? On the one hand, first and foremost, we need divine help. This is when God shows up, right? And He does all the time because He has promised to be with us. And He leads us and He guides us and He teaches us and He forms us. He saves us. We need divine help first and foremost. But make no mistake about it, ladies, we also need human help. We need each other. We need friends. We need relationships. We were not created to live in isolation from each other. And so, sometimes people will rely exclusively on human help rather than on divine help, and they're always disappointed because people will always let you down because people are not infallible. They always are. Okay? Sometimes people will rely exclusively, kind of piously, on divine help. God can help me. God can save me. And they never turn to anybody else to get their wisdom, to get their insight, to receive strength from them. And then they fall flat on their face and they wonder what in the world was going on, when what they failed to realize was that God was trying to help them through somebody else. So we need both. That's why when Daniel has the conversation with the king, he goes to his buddies, Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they immediately all together turn to God for help. He urged for them to plead for mercy from God. Now, the word for mercy here is the word rakam. And what I love about this word rakam, it's there in your notes, okay, is that the word rakam is plural. And so they're not just pleading for mercy from God, they're pleading for mercies from God. In other words, Daniel needs a whole heck of a lot of mercy to get out of this situation, because this is how dark and dire the situation really is. He's going, God, I not only need mercy, I need mercies. Give me some mercy now. That's the only thing that can save me. That's the only thing that can help us. That's the only thing that can rescue us. This is mercy on steroids. Verse 19. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are His. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with Him. I thank and praise You, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we have asked of You. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Now, notice in the NIV, I know they do this. I'm pretty sure they do this in the ESV too. Notice that the genre of this chapter changes for just a second. It changes from prose and it moves into what? Poetry. And you can see this just in the way that they have it laid out, right? You got a bunch of history, you got a bunch of prose, periods, and you just keep on going from line to line. But then all of a sudden, Daniel, when the mystery is revealed, he breaks out into kind of a song, a poetic song. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are His. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells within Him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You give me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we have asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Now, whenever you see a change in the genre of literature in the middle of a chapter, especially when that change is short, because right after this, it goes from poetry right back to prose. Whenever you see a change like that, oftentimes that will signify kind of the pinnacle of the story you're reading. And so here's the pinnacle of the story that we are reading. The pinnacle of the story that we are reading comes right here when God reveals to Daniel Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and Daniel praises God for his revelation. Now, here's the reason I bring this up. Sometimes, when some people interpret the book of Daniel, they figure that the big deal of Daniel, all right, is exactly how you interpret the dreams themselves. Okay, the dreams are important. That's why we get the interpretation of the dream. But the dreams are not the most important. Because the big question of this chapter, do the gods live among men? Do the gods have anything to say to men? Do the gods do anything more than just serve as a thin veneer of religiosity for politics and power? Do the gods do anything more than that? That question has been answered. Because God has revealed to Daniel what the dream is. Now, the revelation's fantastic, don't get me wrong, but the big question has already been answered. The story has already reached its climax, and really, in some sense, its conclusion. Daniel has been saved by God. Why do we need anything more than that? Now, blessedly, we get more. But don't miss the climax of the chapter for the intricacies of the dream. The big deal is that there's a God in heaven who actually says stuff, who actually does stuff, who actually cares about people. That's the big theological point. Everything else is icing. We got that? So we've just gotten to the best part of this chapter. That's it for this week. We'll come back next week. No, we still have 15 minutes. Would you like to know a little something about this dream? Verse 24. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I'll interpret his dream for him. Now this is kind of interesting, because Daniel gets this revelation from God, and notice what he does. He goes back to Arioch, okay, and he says, hey, I have this figured out. I'll tell the king what his dream is and what it means. So don't execute me, but notice, he also puts in a plug for the wise men of Babylon. You know, those necromancers, astrologers, fortune tellers, soothsayers, all the people that are detestable in the Lord's sight in the book of Deuteronomy. All the people that are naturally Daniel's enemies. All the people who are kind of slimy charlatans. He says, save them too. Daniel just doesn't try to save himself. He even tries to save those who have fundamentally different worldviews from his. Now, there was a man who came along one day. He preached this fabulous sermon at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. And he said something to the effect of, love your enemies. Long before he said it, Daniel was doing it. Daniel wants to make sure that even those who are clearly wicked have a chance to hear of and believe in the true God who made the heavens and the earth and who does dwell among men and who does care for them. Verse 25. Now, Arioch shows a little bit of his character here in verse 25. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. Notice that Arioch is kind of sticking his neck out here. Because he brings Daniel in and he says, okay, this guy can tell you what your dream means. Now, what happens if Daniel goes in there and the whole thing falls apart? Who's going to get blamed for that? Daniel, yes. But then also the guy who brought Daniel in, who just wasted the king's time. Arioch apparently has a little bit of guts too. Verse 26, the king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Verse 27, Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain it to the king, the mystery that he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Underline that phrase, in days to come. By the way, the NIV does an abysmal job at translating this phrase. Just terrible. Aren't you happy to know that? Okay. There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Let me translate it differently, okay? He has shown to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the last days. That's much better. In the last days. Now, we'll come back to that in just a second. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you laid on your bed were these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come. You know, things like in the last days. And the revealer of mysteries has showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than any other living man, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Now, let's go back to this phrase, in days to come, or the last days. Here's the reason this phrase is so important. This actually sets up the whole theology of the interpretation of this dream, okay? Because there are two ways that you can interpret this dream. The primary point of this dream can either be A, geopolitical, or B, Christological. Now, this little phrase, in the last days, tells us that this dream, the apex of this dream, the big deal in this dream is B. You want to know why? Turn to Hosea 3, verse 5. Hosea 3, verse 5. And actually, let's start at verse 4, okay? I'm going to read this and then we're just going to kind of go through this, okay? For the Israelites will live many days without a king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or idol. Okay, so, talking about this exile that the Israelites are going to go through. But then afterward, the Israelites will return from the exile. They will seek the Lord their God and David their king. Now, how in the world are the Israelites going to seek David their king? David's long dead by the time of Hosea. How do the Israelites seek David their king? They seek the one who comes after David, who is greater than David. Who is that? He's a son of David, and his name is Jesus. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings. What's the last phrase? In the last days. Okay, turn to Hebrews chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. Hebrews chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets and many times and in various ways. But now, in these, what's the next phrase? Last days. How does God speak now? He speaks to us through his Son. One of the questions that is often asked, okay, is, are we living in the last days? Here's the answer. Yes. You know how I know? Because the last days have been around since Jesus. Right? Hebrews 1, in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. Hosea says there's going to come a day, these days, when the Israelites are going to return to David, now they don't mean they're going to bring him up from the dead. They mean there's going to be a son of David who's going to usher in the last days. And so, when Daniel sets up the whole interpretation of the dream, he sets it up as something that is fulfilled in the last days, Christ. That's where all this is going to. Now, we get some geopolitical stuff before that, but the big deal at the end of the dream, the way all of this ends, is with Jesus. Isn't that good news? And so, we got these last days that are coming. And here is how they're going to pan out. Verse 31. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. By the way, the word awesome there is the word dekal, and it's probably a word that means frightening. And so you can understand why the king is troubled by this dream in the first place, right? He sees this big statue in a dream, and the statue isn't just really awe-inspiring, it's scary. So, it's a scary statue. Verse 32. The head of the statue is made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. Now, the word cut out, it's the word gazar. Okay, G-E-Z-A-R. You'll see it there on your notes. And the word gazar can mean cut outs, and really it's a word that can mean all sorts of cutting. So here, it's cut out. It is often translated as cut off. Now, you want to see where it's translated cut off? Isaiah 53 verse 8. Isaiah 53 verse 8. Somebody want to read Isaiah 53 verse 8?
By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken.
All right, this word cut off in Isaiah 53 verse 8. This is the word gazar as well. Now, anybody know to whom Isaiah 53 refers? Does anybody know? Isaiah 53 is a great prophecy of Jesus, okay? Most famous line in Isaiah 53, for he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, right? The chastisement was upon him that made us whole, and by his wounds we are healed. Okay? He was cut off from the land of the living. That's a prophecy of the crucifixion. Very next verse, he's assigned the grave with the rich. Remember Joseph of Arimathea, the guy who lends Jesus his grave? Was he rich? Yes. But he eventually sees the light of day. Isaiah 53 is all about Jesus. Jesus is gazard. Now, all of a sudden here in Daniel chapter 2, we have a rock. And the rock is gazard, but not by human hands. Do you guys remember the line in Isaiah 53 where it says, but it was the Lord's will to afflict him? That finally, men thought they were doing the cross, but really this was part of the divine plan all along. It almost seems like Daniel 2 echoes Isaiah 53. It almost seems like all of this is heading for Jesus. Now, the church fathers had a great time with this, okay? Irenaeus, he was a church father. He said the expression "it was cut out without hands" signified that this was not a work of man, but it was a work and the will of the Father and God of all things who brought Jesus forth. Church fathers are saying, okay, now we're cooking with gas. This is where the prophecy gets really, really good. There's a rock that's cut out, that's cut off, that's gazard, just like Jesus is in Isaiah 53, but not by human hands, just like Jesus is cut off, finally by God, because it was the Lord's will to afflict him. Now, notice what the rock does. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and it smashed them. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces, and at the same time became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. Let's do a couple of different things. First, Isaiah 40, verses 23 and 24. Anybody want to read verses 23 and 24? Isaiah 40, verses 23 and 24.
Brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground, than it grows on them and they wither. And a whirlwind sweeps them away like a shadow.
All right. Sounds like Daniel's language, right? There's the statue. A rock is cut out not by human hands of the statue. It smashes the statue, and what happens to the statue? The wind sweeps it away. Kind of amazing how the statue gets smashed by a pebble. Then the pebble becomes a huge mountain. We'll come back to the huge mountain a little bit later. But here's what I want you to notice. A rock smashes everything, and everything else gets swept away. Now, Jesus, interestingly enough, is referred to as a rock, a cornerstone. Jesus says to Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. And so, we got the payoff of this dream even before we get to the rest of the statue. Daniel starts with Jesus. He starts with what's going to happen to this statue. This statue and everything that it represents, all the geopolitical stuff that it represents, is not going to last. Jesus will take care of it all. You guys remember way back in Genesis 3, where God comes to Adam and Eve after Adam and Eve have sinned. And he makes a promise in the form of a curse to the snake. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. And he shall bruise your heel, and you shall crush his head. The idea here is that this is a prophecy of Jesus, the first prophecy of Jesus. And already there, Jesus is crushing everything. Once again, Jesus is crushing everything. And he does it by a cross. Isn't that strange? That's the glory of the gospel. All the kingdoms, all the powers, all the politics, all the desires of this world, if they're not in line with Jesus, they get crushed. Because as we're going to find out, verse 44, in the time of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure for how long? For forever. We'll talk about that next time. We'll talk about the kingdoms, and we'll talk about the ending. Any questions before we wrap up? If there's, yes.
In his prayer, at the end of the prayer, he says, even now you have made known to me what we have requested of you.
Uh-huh.
And then he says, for you have made known to us the king's matter.
Yes.
The interpretation was only given to Daniel.
Well, here's the deal, okay? It very well could be, because a lot of times pronouns get a little bit slippery. In fact, we just an example. This happens in the Bible too, by the way. Okay, a lot of times we will use plural pronouns that refer back to singular antecedents. Let me see if I can give you an example. Okay, if we want to say the person was having a good time with their toy. Now, person is singular. There is what? Plural. And yet, usually we kind of get that in our heads, even though it really should be the person was having a good time with his toy, or the person was having a good time with her toy, not the person was having a good time with their toy. Now, the Bible can sometimes get a little bit slippery on its pronouns as well. And so this is probably an example of that. Yes, the dream was given to Daniel. Now, does that mean that it wasn't given to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Quite frankly, that isn't clear. Now, it could be that Daniel could have gotten the dream, which is what it seems like here. You've made known to me what we asked of you, he and his friends. And then it could be that Daniel shared that with his friends. So all of those are possible. This is one of these things where we scratch our heads a little bit and go, it could be a slippery use of the pronoun. It could be that it was revealed to all the friends. And it could be that it was revealed to Daniel and he shared it with others of his friends. Which one would you like, A, B, or C? All three are possible. And I don't mean that as a cop-out. I just mean this is one of those things where if you watch the language closely, which you have, okay, you begin to realize that you have different options here as to how you'd like to interpret this. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, and again, here's the thing. A singular revelation to a singular person does not exclude the same revelation to other people by default. Does that make sense? In other words, okay, just because something is revealed to one person doesn't mean that it cannot be revealed to anybody and everybody else. Okay, there's no explicit statement that says it has not been revealed to anybody else but Daniel. Then we'd be working with a totally different interpretive framework. Okay, the primary person that it's been revealed to is who? Daniel. Why? Because he's the one who's going to go into the king. He's the one on whom this whole chapter hinges, right? Okay, he's the main character. We'll get to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3. And so, obviously, it's revealed to him. Now, the question is, did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get some of this too? My own personal thought is that it probably was revealed to Daniel just initially, and then he shared it with his buds. That'd be kind of my guess.
So the reason why I asked that
Yeah.
is in verse 36,
Mm-hmm.
it says, this was the dream, now we will tell the interpretation.
Yeah. And the deal is this, it doesn't seem like Daniel's comrades are there, right? It doesn't seem like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there. It just seems like Daniel is there. And so, here's the deal with this. Again, this is where pronouns get slippery. This could be where Daniel is speaking for he and for his friends. Sometimes we'll do this, collective pronouns. When I write, I'll talk about we all the time, referring not necessarily to just me, but to myself and like Concordia Lutheran Church or the pastoral staff or whoever. And so this is the problem with pronouns, folks. Yeah.
I missed the first thing, so you might have to touch on this then, but I see you translating it in Hebrew. Was Daniel written in more than one language?
Yes, it was. In fact, here, I failed to mention this. Verse 4, okay? Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic. Now, chapter 1 into the beginning of chapter 2 is in Hebrew. Beginning right there, when they say, "O king, live forever," everything switches into Aramaic until the end of Daniel chapter 7. Now, I need to tell you something, okay? My Hebrew is a little rusty. My Greek's okay. My Hebrew's a little rusty. My Aramaic is like really rusty. But I have lots of help. So, that's good. So yes, from here until the end of chapter 7, it's in Aramaic, and then we switch back to Hebrew at the beginning of chapter 8. Sure. Any other questions? Thank you for coming this morning. Deeply appreciate it. We're going to finish up this dream. We're going to talk about the statue. We're going to see what it means. And we're going to find out it's all about Jesus. Deal?